The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long, ominous shadows across the marble floor. 9-year-old Emma Martinez sat in the back of her mother's car in the parking lot, her stomach twisted into knots so tight she felt like she couldn't breathe. She wore her best dress, the navy one with white flowers that her mother had helped her pick out last week. Both of them hoping it would make her look more believable, more trustworthy, more worthy of being heard. But as Emma looked at her pale reflection in the car window, she didn't recognize herself. The girl staring back looked terrified, fragile, like she might shatter into a million pieces at any moment. Beside her sat Buddy, her golden retriever German Shepherd mix, his large, warm body providing the only comfort Emma could find. Buddy had always been there, through the difficult nights when she cried quietly into her pillow, through the anxiety attacks that made her heart race uncontrollably, and through the lonely afternoons after her parents separated when the house felt impossibly empty. She ran her trembling fingers through his soft fur, and he turned to look at her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. Dogs were special that way. They didn't judge. They didn't question. They simply loved unconditionally, asking nothing in return except loyalty and affection. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," her mother, Sophia, whispered from the driver's seat, reaching back to squeeze Emma's knee. But Emma could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the same uncertainty that had been growing for months now. Sophia's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, and her eyes were red-rimmed from countless nights of crying and stress. The divorce had been brutal. Her father's infidelity had shocked everyone, but what followed was worse. A custody battle that had transformed Emma from a child into a bargaining chip, a prize to be fought over rather than a person to be protected. Emma's father, Robert, had initially agreed to shared custody during the divorce proceedings. But over the past 18 months, something had shifted. He'd become increasingly dismissive of Emma during their scheduled visits. The words had started small, comments about her grades not being good enough, observations about her appearance that made her cheeks burn with shame, suggestions that she was too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. But they had escalated. By the time Emma's mother finally decided to take legal action, Emma had internalized all of it, believing deep down that maybe her father was right. Maybe she was too much. Maybe she didn't deserve better. Her mother had initially asked Emma about the visits, casual questions about what they'd done, whether she'd had fun. But Emma had stayed silent, not wanting to hurt her mother's feelings or make things worse. When Sophia finally sat Emma down 3 months ago and asked directly if something was wrong during father's visits, the dam had broken. Emma had sobbed for hours, finally releasing the pain she'd been carrying alone. Through her tears, she described the criticism, the coldness, the way her father made her feel invisible and worthless. That's when Sophia knew she had to act. The drive to family court had been agonizing. Emma had barely eaten breakfast, her nervous stomach rejecting even her favorite cereal. Her mother had reminded her that she just needed to tell the truth, that all she had to do was explain to the judge what had been happening, and everything would be okay. Emma wanted to believe her. She really did. But deep inside, in that place where children store their deepest fears, Emma knew that adults didn't always listen to children. Adults had their own agendas, their own versions of truth, their own ways of dismissing what children tried to tell them. Now, sitting in the courtroom itself, Emma felt even smaller than usual. The ceiling stretched impossibly high above her head, and everything was so formal, so official, so absolutely terrifying. The room smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the air felt heavy with an almost suffocating weight. Lawyers in dark suits moved around like chess pieces, shuffling documents and having whispered conversations in corners. Her father sat on the opposite side of the room with his attorney, and he kept shooting her looks that made her skin crawl, not overtly angry or threatening, but dismissive, as if she were merely an inconvenience, a minor obstacle in his day. Judge entered the courtroom and everyone stood. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair, and a face that seemed permanently etched with a look of weary skepticism. He settled into his high chair behind the bench, immediately creating a dynamic that made Emma feel impossibly small and powerless. From her perspective, he looked like a god dispensing judgment from on high, and she was merely an insignificant mortal hoping for mercy she knew she probably wouldn't receive. The proceedings began with formal statements. Emma's mother's attorney presented the case methodically, citing the emotional neglect allegations, the documented anxiety issues Emma had developed, the therapist's concerns. Then it was her father's turn. His attorney painted a very different picture, a devoted father who had been manipulated by an ex-wife desperate to limit his relationship with his daughter. He suggested that Emma's anxiety was exaggerated, that children often misinterpreted parental guidance as criticism, that this was all part of a coordinated effort to poison his relationship with Emma. Emma felt her heart sinking deeper with each word. The judge's expression remained neutral, but his eyes seemed to grow colder, more dismissive. When it came time for Emma to speak, she approached the witness stand with legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. Buddy remained at her mother's side, pressed protectively against her leg. Emma took an oath to tell the truth, her small hand barely registering on the Bible she was asked to hold. As she tried to explain her feelings, to describe the painful experiences during her father's visits, she stumbled over her words. She cried. She struggled to articulate the emotional pain in a way that made logical sense. Judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical. He interrupted her several times, asking questions that seemed designed to poke holes in her narrative. "Isn't it possible you're confused?" he asked. "Children sometimes misunderstand adult intentions. Are you certain you're remembering these interactions accurately?" By the time Emma finished testifying, she felt utterly defeated. The judge exchanged knowing looks with her father's attorney, a subtle glance that seemed to communicate everything Emma needed to know. This man didn't believe her. He thought she was lying or confused or coached by her mother. He looked at her as if she were a nuisance, a child making mountains out of molehills, an inconvenience disrupting his courtroom schedule. The judge shuffled through his documents, preparing his final ruling. Emma could feel it coming, the decision that would force her to spend even more time with the man who made her feel so utterly worthless. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became shallow. Buddy, sensing her escalating panic from across the room, whined softly, pulling against her mother's gentle restraint. Emma looked at the judge, at her defeated mother, at her cold father, and she realized with crystalline clarity that no one was going to save her. No one was going to truly hear her. The system had failed her, just as she'd secretly feared it would. "Heard enough," Judge announced, his voice carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. The gavel hovered just inches above the wooden block on his bench, suspended in that terrible moment before it would come crashing down and seal Emma's fate. Emma's entire body went rigid. Time seemed to stop. The oxygen in the courtroom felt like it was being sucked away, leaving her gasping silently, her small chest heaving beneath her flowered dress. The judge didn't even look at Emma when he spoke. He addressed her mother's attorney with the tired patience of a man who had already made up his mind before the evidence was even presented. "The allegations presented today lack sufficient substantiation. The child's testimony, while emotionally charged, appears to be heavily influenced by the custodial parent and lacks the specific details necessary to overturn the current custody arrangement." Each word felt like a physical blow, landing squarely in Emma's chest, stealing her breath and her hope simultaneously. Emma's attorney stood up, attempting to interject, to offer additional evidence, to fight back against the injustice unfolding in real time, but Judge simply held up his hand, silencing her with a gesture. "The court finds no credible evidence of emotional abuse. Parental discipline and high expectations, while perhaps stern, do not constitute neglect under family law." He finally looked down at Emma, and his gaze was utterly devoid of compassion. It was the look a person might give a piece of furniture they decided to discard, functional but ultimately disposable, not worthy of further consideration. Emma watched her father's face transform. His expression shifted from careful neutrality to something darker, something that made her stomach clench with dread. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, not a genuine smile of happiness, but something more predatory. It was the same expression he wore during their visits when he'd made a particularly cutting comment and watched her face crumple. It was the smile of someone who had just won a battle they'd been fighting relentlessly, someone who had just confirmed their victory over an opponent they considered beneath them. Robert Martinez leaned over and whispered something to his attorney, who nodded and began packing up his briefcase with deliberate, satisfied movements. Emma could practically feel the smugness radiating off him. He had won. The system had sided with him, just as he'd clearly known it would. He had money for the best lawyer. He had the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. And most importantly, he had a judge who was too tired, too jaded, or perhaps too biased to see through his carefully constructed facade. Emma's mother gripped her hand so tightly that it actually hurt. Sophia's fingernails dug slightly into Emma's palm, and Emma could feel the trembling that had taken over her mother's entire body. She glanced up at her mom's face and saw something that terrified her more than anything else that day. She saw her mother's hope dying in real time. Sophia's eyes welled with tears, but she held them back, clearly trying to stay strong for Emma's sake. But Emma knew the truth. Her mother had failed. The system had failed, and more importantly, no one, absolutely no one, had believed her. The courtroom began to empty as the judge's clerk called the next case. Lawyers gathered their materials. The court officer who had been standing by the door shifted his weight. Life was moving on, normal and indifferent, while Emma's entire world collapsed around her. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the outcome she had feared in her darkest moments. Within weeks, she would be forced to spend extended time with her father. The visits would increase from every other weekend to week-long stays during summer break. The judgment had been rendered, and there was no appeal, no second chance, no miracle waiting in the wings. A sound cut through Emma's spiraling thoughts, Buddy's whine from where he sat pressed against her mother's legs. The dog had sensed the devastation in the room, the crushing weight of despair that had settled over Sophia and Emma like a suffocating blanket. Buddy's brown eyes fixed on Emma, and for just a moment she felt the smallest flicker of something other than despair. Buddy understood. Buddy believed her. Buddy had always known the truth about how she felt, even when she couldn't articulate it herself. Emma's mother stood up mechanically, still holding Emma's hand. They began walking toward the courtroom exit, moving like automatons through the heavy wooden doors. In the hallway outside, Emma's attorney caught up with them, placing a sympathetic hand on Sophia's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "This is extremely frustrating. The judge was clearly resistant to the testimony from the beginning. We can explore appeals, but honestly," she trailed off, and Emma understood what she wasn't saying. Appeals were expensive, time-consuming, and statistically unlikely to succeed. They had lost. Sophia knelt down in front of Emma, right there in the courthouse hallway where anyone could see them. Her eyes were finally unleashing the tears she'd been holding back all morning. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered, pulling Emma into her arms. "I'm so sorry I couldn't fix this. I tried so hard." Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder and the dam broke. Everything she'd been holding inside came pouring out. The fear, the sadness, the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Not just betrayal by her father, but by the judge, by the system, by a world that seemed designed to punish children for speaking the truth. Her entire body shook with sobs so intense she could barely breathe. She felt utterly powerless, utterly defeated, utterly alone. Buddy pushed his way between them, his large body forcing itself into the embrace. He nuzzled Emma's face, his warm tongue licking away her tears. His presence was the only thing keeping her grounded, the only thing preventing her from completely fragmenting under the weight of the injustice. That's when something shifted inside Emma. As she sat there in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the bustle of other cases, other families, other legal battles, a thought emerged from the depths of her despair. She had one last option, one final card she hadn't yet played. For months, she and Buddy had been practicing their secret signal, the one thing she'd been saving, not quite knowing why, perhaps sensing on some instinctive level that she might need it someday. She pulled back from her mother's embrace and looked down at Buddy, really looked at him. His intelligent eyes seemed to be asking her a question. Are you ready? Do you trust me? Emma took a shaky breath. The courtroom doors were still open behind them. Judge was still in there, reviewing documents for the next case. Emma knew it was probably pointless. She knew it would probably make things worse. But as she sat there in that moment of absolute despair, she realized she had absolutely nothing left to lose. The worst had already happened. Her father had won. But maybe, just maybe, there was one more thing she could try. One last, desperate attempt to make someone understand the truth. She squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, I'm not giving up yet. 6 months earlier, on an afternoon in early spring, Emma sat in doctor's office for what felt like the 100th therapy session. The psychologist's space was deliberately calming. Soft colors, comfortable furniture, shelves lined with books about emotions and feelings. A small fountain in the corner created gentle, trickling sounds that were supposed to be soothing. But Emma's anxiety was far too powerful to be calmed by water features and pastel walls. Doctor had been working with Emma since her parents' separation, helping her navigate the emotional devastation of a fractured family. But as the weeks progressed and Emma started opening up about her father's visits, Doctor's concern had escalated. She recognized the signs of emotional trauma, the self-blame, the diminished self-worth, the way Emma flinched when adults raised their voices even slightly. Emma, Doctor had said during that particular session, leaning forward with genuine concern etched across her kind face, I want to teach you something that might help when your anxiety gets really intense. It's called grounding, and it works best when you have something physical to anchor to, something that reminds your body and mind that you're safe. Emma had listened, though her mind felt foggy with the weight of her emotions. Doctor had explained various grounding techniques, the 5-4-3-2-1 sensory method, breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation. But then Doctor had suggested something different, something that made Emma's eyes light up for the first time in months. You know what might be even more powerful? Doctor had asked. What if you created a signal between you and Buddy? Something that only you two know about. When your anxiety is at its peak, you could give Buddy a specific signal, and he could help ground you by responding in a way that reminds you that you're safe, that someone is there for you, that you're not alone. Emma had left that session with a mission. She'd gone home, let Buddy out into the backyard, and spent hours just thinking about what signal would feel right. It had to be something subtle enough that it wouldn't draw attention if she ever needed to use it in public. It had to be something distinct enough that Buddy would recognize it as different from their normal interactions. And it had to mean something. It had to carry the weight of her desperation and her trust in Buddy. That evening, sitting on her bedroom floor with Buddy sprawled across the carpet, Emma had developed their secret language. She decided on 2 components. First, a gentle tap on her left shoulder, the side closer to her heart, followed by a specific whistle pattern that she'd practice until it became second nature. The pattern was 3 short bursts, then a longer note. She'd chosen the shoulder tap because it felt intimate, like she was physically touching that part of herself that hurt the most, and Buddy would understand her pain. The training had begun the very next day. Emma would practice the signal in her room, and the moment Buddy responded with the correct alert behavior, she'd shower him with treats, praise, and love. Buddy had always been incredibly intelligent, with an almost supernatural ability to read Emma's emotions. Within just a few days, he'd begun to understand the signal. His ears would perk up immediately. His entire body language would shift into what Emma thought of as protective alert mode. He would position himself closer to her, his eyes locked on her face, ready to respond to any need. But Emma had wanted Buddy to take it one step further. She'd worked with him on a specific vocalization, a single, sharp bark that signaled genuine distress rather than casual play or excitement. She'd combined this with her therapist's guidance and practiced the entire sequence until it felt almost like a dance between them. Tap shoulder, whistle pattern, Buddy's ears up, Buddy's focused stance, single alert bark. Over the next month, Emma had refined the signal in various situations. She'd practice in her room, in the living room, in the backyard. She'd occasionally test it at different times of day to ensure Buddy's response remained consistent. Her mother had noticed the new interaction between Emma and her dog, but hadn't questioned it. In fact, Sophia had seemed relieved to see Emma engaged in something positive, something that brought a small smile to her daughter's face. What neither her mother nor doctor knew was that Emma had also begun testing the signal in situations of actual stress. One afternoon, after receiving a bad grade on a math test, Emma had felt her anxiety spiraling. She'd gone to Buddy and performed their signal. Buddy had responded perfectly, his alert presence grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in her struggle. The signal worked. She'd tested it again after a particularly difficult phone call with her father, during which he'd criticized her athletic abilities. She'd gone to her room, performed the signal, and Buddy had come alive with protective energy. He'd stayed by her side for hours, his presence a constant reassurance that she was safe, that she was loved, that she mattered to someone even if she didn't matter to her father. By the time her mother had sat her down to discuss the custody lawsuit, Emma and Buddy had perfected their signal. It had become their most intimate secret, their shared language of survival and protection. But Emma had kept it hidden, even from her therapist. Some part of her, a wise, instinctive part, had seemed to sense that she might need this secret weapon for something bigger, something more important than managing everyday anxiety. In the weeks leading up to the courtroom appearance, Emma had practiced the signal obsessively. She'd lie in bed at night, running through the exact sequence in her mind. Tap, tap on the left shoulder. Whistle pattern, short, 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 long. She'd visualized Buddy's response, imagining his ears perking up, his body tensing into that perfect alert stance, his protective bark cutting through whatever noise surrounded them. Her mother had asked her several times if she was nervous about testifying. Emma had assured her she was okay, but the truth was much more complex. She was terrified. She was devastated, but she was also preparing. She was rehearsing mentally for a moment she didn't even know if she'd have the courage to execute. Now sitting in the courthouse hallway with her mother and Buddy, Emma's mind crystallized around a single, desperate realization. She had one card left to play. Everyone in that courtroom, the judge, her father, the lawyers, they'd all dismissed her. They'd decided her words, her truth, her experience didn't matter. But what if she could show them something they couldn't dismiss? What if she could demonstrate her emotional state in a way that transcended language, that moved beyond the judge's skepticism? It was a slim chance. It was probably foolish. It might backfire spectacularly. But as Emma looked into Buddy's intelligent eyes, she felt something shift inside her. A spark of defiance ignited in the ashes of her defeat. She wasn't going down without one final attempt. Emma stood up, still holding her mother's hand. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying, "I need to go back in there. Just for one more minute, please. I need to try something." Sophia looked confused, her eyes red-rimmed and devastated. "Honey, I don't think that's a good idea. The judge has made his decision. Going back in there won't change anything. Please, Mom, just trust me and Buddy." There was something in Emma's voice, something resolute, something determined despite her tears, that made Sophia pause. She exchanged a glance with Emma's attorney, who shrugged helplessly. What did they have to lose? The worst had already happened. "Okay," Sophia whispered. "Okay, baby, let's try." Emma took a deep breath, squeezed Buddy's fur one more time for courage, and turned back toward the courtroom doors. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. This was it. This was her last chance. Everything depended on what she was about to do. She was going back in. The courtroom doors felt heavier as Emma pushed through them the second time. The wooden barriers seemed to resist her, as if the universe itself was trying to prevent what she was about to attempt. But she pressed forward, her small frame surprisingly determined, Buddy moving like a shadow at her side. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, his usual playful demeanor replaced with something more serious, more alert. Judge was already reviewing documents for the next case when Emma re-entered. He didn't look up immediately. His clerk continued shuffling papers at her desk. Emma's father and his attorney had begun gathering their belongings, clearly satisfied that their business here was concluded. But Emma's attorney, Sarah, immediately stood up, her professional demeanor shifting to one of cautious concern. "Your Honor," Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the courtroom's ambient noise. "We have a request to present additional information." Judge looked up from his documents, his expression shifting from neutral to outright annoyed. He appeared to be a man who did not appreciate interruptions, a man whose schedule was rigidly structured and whose patience had already been thoroughly depleted. "Ms., we've concluded the testimony portion of this hearing. The court has rendered its decision. What additional information could possibly be?" "Please, Your Honor," Emma interrupted, her voice small but surprisingly steady. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward her. Her father's attorney held up a hand, ready to object, but the judge held up his own hand, silencing them. "Young lady, you don't speak in my courtroom unless spoken to," Judge said sternly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. But something in his expression shifted slightly as he noticed Emma's determination, the way she stood despite her obvious fear. "I just want to show you something," Emma said quietly. "Please, just 30 seconds." Judge sighed deeply, the sound of a man utterly exhausted by the human drama constantly unfolding before him. He exchanged a look with the bailiff, clearly considering ejecting Emma from the courtroom for her presumption. But then something, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a momentary crack in his cynicism, made him lean back in his chair. "You have 30 seconds, he said flatly. "What do you want to show me?" Emma's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment everything would either work or catastrophically fail. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, each beat so forceful it felt like it might break through her small body. Buddy pressed against her leg and she took a moment to draw strength from his presence. She reached down and gently stroked his head, silently communicating, "It's okay. This is our moment. This is when we show them the truth." Emma took a breath so deep that her entire chest expanded. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath with her. Even the usually indifferent judge appeared to lean forward slightly, drawn by the intensity of her focus. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, Emma raised her right hand. Everyone watched, clearly confused about what she was attempting to do. Her father's attorney started to object, but no one stopped Emma as she brought her hand to her left shoulder. Tap, tap. The sound was soft in the courtroom, barely audible over the ambient noise of the building around them. Then came the whistle, the specific pattern she and Buddy had practiced hundreds of times. Short, 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 then long. The sound cut through the courtroom like a blade, distinct and purposeful. For one agonizing millisecond, nothing happened. Emma's heart began to plummet. Had Buddy forgotten? Had the practice sessions been for nothing? Had she just humiliated herself and her mother for no reason? Then, like lightning striking, Buddy transformed. The dog's ears shot upright with almost violent intensity, his entire body snapping into what could only be described as a state of acute alert. His brown eyes locked onto Emma's face with laser-focused intensity. His massive frame rose from its sitting position in a single, fluid motion that conveyed urgency and purpose. His muscles tensed visibly, every fiber of his being coiled and ready to respond to whatever threat he perceived. And then he barked, a single, sharp vocalization that echoed through the entire courtroom like a gunshot. It wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniably distressed. It was the sound of a being who recognized that the person he loved most in the world was in crisis. Buddy immediately positioned himself directly in front of Emma, his body creating a barrier between her and the rest of the courtroom. His stance was protective, almost defiant, a four-legged wall of loyalty and love standing against whatever threats surrounded her. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Emma's father jolted backward so violently that he knocked over his chair. His attorney jumped up, her briefcase falling to the floor with a crash that scattered documents across the marble tiles. The judge's clerk gasped audibly. Even the bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his belt, confused about whether this represented a threat. But Judge didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. His entire body had gone rigid, and his expression had transformed completely. The skepticism, the weariness, the dismissive coldness that had characterized his demeanor throughout the entire hearing had simply vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. Buddy remained in his protective stance, his attention never wavering from Emma. She reached down and placed her trembling hand on his head, feeling his warmth, his solidity, his unwavering presence. The dog's body remained tense, every muscle poised and ready, but his eyes, his intelligent, devoted eyes, never left Emma's face. "This is outrageous," Emma's father's attorney sputtered, moving toward them. "This is clearly a stunt designed to manipulate the court. This dog is being abused, forced to perform." "Silence," Judge said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. His eyes remained fixed on Buddy and Emma, studying them with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to the core of truth itself. "Everyone, remain where you are and remain silent." The courtroom fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the sound of Buddy's heavy breathing and Emma's own ragged breaths. The dog's protective stance remained perfect, unwavering. He didn't bark again, didn't move, didn't break his focus on Emma for a single second. Judge rose slowly from his chair, descending from the bench with deliberate movements. Every person in the courtroom seemed to freeze as he approached Emma and Buddy. Emma felt terror spike through her system. What if he was angry? What if she just made everything worse? The judge stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance from Buddy's protective barrier. He studied them both for what felt like an eternity. Emma's tear-stained face, her trembling hand on Buddy's head, the dog's absolutely unwavering focus on his girl. The judge's stern expression seemed to soften, cracks appearing in the facade of judicial authority. "How long have you trained this signal?" he asked quietly, his voice different now, lower, more human, stripped of its previous coldness. 6 months," Emma stammered, surprised that he was actually speaking to her, actually treating her like she mattered. "Since I started seeing Doctor, we practiced it every day. And he's reacting to your emotional state right now, not because you've trained him to perform on command." He knows when I'm really scared," Emma whispered. "He always knows. He's known since before we had the signal. The signal just helps me ask him for help when I can't say it with words." Judge turned back to study Buddy's unwavering stance, the dog's absolute focus on Emma's. Then he looked at Emma's father, whose face had gone pale, then at the courtroom around them, at the dozens of expressions of shock and realization written on every face. When the judge finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight it hadn't possessed before, the weight of a man whose understanding had just fundamentally shifted. "We're going to need to reconvene this hearing," he said slowly, "and I think we're going to need some additional professional consultation on this matter." Emma felt Buddy's body relax slightly, though he remained alert. She looked down at her devoted companion and realized that her secret weapon hadn't failed her. Against all odds, against the judge's skepticism, against the entire weight of the legal system, Buddy had come through. The truth had finally been heard. Judge stood motionless in the center of the courtroom, his eyes fixed on Buddy with an intensity that seemed to penetrate beyond the dog's physical form into something far deeper, something like truth itself. For a man who had spent 37 years on the bench, who had presided over countless custody disputes, domestic violence cases, and emotional testimonies, This moment represented something that had become increasingly rare in his long career: genuine uncertainty about his own judgment. He slowly returned to the bench, his movements deliberate and measured, each step heavy with the weight of reconsideration. As he settled back into his chair, he removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that suddenly made him look less like an authority figure and more like a tired man grappling with a profound mistake. "Bailiff," said quietly, "please ensure that Ms. Martinez, her daughter, and the dog remain in the courtroom. Ms., I want you to remain as well. Mr. Martinez, you may leave if you wish, but I advise you to stay." Emma's father exchanged a panicked glance with his attorney, who began making rapid calculations about what this sudden turn of events might mean for their case. The smugness that had characterized their expressions just moments earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like fear. Judge leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied the scene before him. Buddy had finally relaxed his rigid protective stance, though he remained pressed against Emma's side, his alert status never quite diminishing. Emma's hand stayed buried in the dog's fur, drawing comfort from the connection. "In my 37 years presiding over family law cases," Judge began, his voice carrying a reflective quality that seemed to surprise even himself, "I have witnessed countless attempts to manipulate this court. I have seen parents coach children to make false accusations. I have seen emotional outbursts carefully orchestrated to sway judicial opinion. I have become, perhaps overly cautious about distinguishing genuine distress from performance." He paused, looking directly at Emma with an expression that was difficult to categorize, not quite remorse, but something approaching it. "But what I just witnessed," he continued, "was not a performance. I recognize that fact in the same way I've learned to recognize many things over my decades on the bench. You see, I spent 15 years as a veterinary behaviorist before I became a lawyer. Before I entered law school, I specialized in animal psychology and behavioral analysis. I spent decades studying how animals respond to human emotional states." Emma's eyes widened. She hadn't known this about the judge. Neither had her attorney, judging by the shocked expression on Sarah's face. "That dog," said, gesturing toward Buddy with his pen, "is not responding to a trained command in the traditional sense. What I observed was a behavioral response rooted in genuine emotional recognition. The dog's ears didn't just perk up, they rotated in a specific pattern that indicates acute stress detection. His body positioning wasn't performed, it was instinctive. His single vocalization carried the acoustic signatures of authentic distress recognition, not theatrical performance." He turned his attention to Emma's father and his attorney. "More importantly, I've spent enough time around animals to know that no amount of coaching could create what I just witnessed. That kind of authentic behavioral bond, that kind of instinctive protective response, these cannot be manufactured or trained through conventional means. They emerge only in response to genuine emotional distress and genuine loving attachment." Emma felt tears beginning to stream down her face again, but this time they felt different. Less like tears of despair and more like tears of validation, of finally being seen and believed. Judge stood up again and approached Emma, this time getting close enough to observe Buddy more carefully. The dog's body remained protective but not aggressive, his eyes watchful but not threatening. "Young lady," said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, "I made an error in judgment today. I let my cynicism, my professional wariness, override what should have been a more complete assessment of the evidence presented. I dismissed your testimony too quickly because I've heard so many conflicting stories over the years that I've perhaps become deaf to authentic pain when I hear it." He reached out and allowed Buddy to sniff his hand, a gesture of respect and apology offered not to Emma, but through her beloved companion. "Your dog just taught me a lesson I clearly needed to relearn," said quietly. "Truth has many languages. Not all of it comes through human words and legal arguments. Sometimes it comes through the unwavering loyalty of an animal who knows, with absolute certainty, the emotional state of the person they love most. He returned to his bench and addressed the entire courtroom, his voice taking on the formal tone of judicial authority once again, but this time infused with something that hadn't been there before: genuine humility. I am ordering a complete recess of these proceedings. I want comprehensive psychological evaluations conducted on Emma Martinez by court-appointed professionals. I want her existing therapy records reviewed by independent specialists. I want her to undergo formal assessment regarding her emotional support animal and their bonding patterns. I want all of this completed within 2 weeks. He looked directly at Emma's father. Mr. Martinez, I am also ordering that you participate in a psychological evaluation to assess your parenting practices and emotional interactions with your daughter. This is not optional. This is a court order. Emma's father's face flushed red with indignation, but he remained silent, clearly recognizing that he had lost significant ground. Furthermore, continued, addressing Emma's mother, Ms. Martinez, I am temporarily modifying the custody arrangement pending the results of these evaluations. Your daughter will remain in your primary custody until we have had the opportunity to properly assess this situation with the thoroughness it deserves. Sarah, Emma's attorney, stood up, her professional composure momentarily cracking as relief and vindication washed over her features. Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence. The evidence, interrupted gently, includes more than legal arguments and testimony. It includes the voice of a being who has no ability to lie, no motivation to deceive, and no stake in the legal outcome except the of the child she loves. We would be wise to listen to that voice. Emma felt her mother's arms come around her from behind, pulling her into an embrace. Buddy leaned his full weight against Emma, his protective presence now a celebration rather than a shield against threat. But Judge wasn't finished. He gestured for everyone to approach the bench, and he addressed Emma directly, his expression serious but no longer cold. Emma, he said, using her first name rather than the child or any legal designation, I owe you an apology. I dismissed your truth today because I let cynicism blind me to reality. Your bravery in coming back into this courtroom, your willingness to show me something as intimate and vulnerable as your connection with this dog, that took extraordinary courage. I will do better. This court will do better. Emma nodded, unable to speak through her tears and overwhelming emotions. Judge turned his attention to Buddy one final time. And you, he said softly, addressing the dog as if speaking to a fellow professional, you reminded this old judge that justice isn't always found in documents and legal precedent. Sometimes it's found in the simple, undeniable truth of loyalty and love. Thank you for that reminder. As the courtroom began to shift and reorganize for the next steps in the revised proceedings, Emma realized something profound had changed. The judge's skepticism hadn't just cracked, it had shattered completely, revealing a man capable of recognizing when he'd been wrong, capable of growth, capable of humility. Buddy had done more than react to a signal. He had fundamentally altered the trajectory of justice itself. The following week felt like stepping into a different universe entirely. The courthouse hallways, which had seemed so cold and hostile just days earlier, now carried an almost surreal sense of purpose and urgency. Judge's order had set in motion a flurry of professional activity. Psychologists scheduled, therapists coordinated, evaluators prepared. Emma found herself transported from the despair of defeat to something far more complex. The fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally listen. The first evaluation took place in a small, comfortable office that looked nothing like the sterile courthouse. Dr. Richardson, a child psychologist specializing in family trauma, had warm eyes and a gentle demeanor that immediately put Emma at ease. What made the appointment particularly significant was that Judge had specifically requested that Buddy be allowed to accompany Emma during the evaluations. This single decision would prove transformative. Emma sat on a comfortable couch with Buddy's head resting in her lap as Dr. Richardson began the formal assessment. The psychologist had a checklist of standard questions designed to probe for signs of emotional abuse, neglect, and psychological trauma. But what made this evaluation different from the initial courtroom testimony was that Emma didn't feel rushed, didn't feel judged, didn't feel like she had to convince someone of her pain. "I want you to know," Dr. Richardson said at the outset, "that this is a safe space. There's no judge here, no lawyers. This is just about understanding your experience and there are no right or wrong answers." Emma nodded, her fingers continuing to stroke Buddy's soft fur. The dog remained in his calm, attentive state, present without being intrusive, supportive without demanding attention. As Emma began to talk, really talk, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, something shifted inside her. The words that had felt trapped in her throat during the courtroom testimony began to flow more freely. She described specific incidents from her father's visits, the time he'd criticized her artwork at school, calling it childish and unoriginal. The occasion when he'd made comments about her weight and suggested she should exercise more. The pattern of coldness when she tried to share her feelings, his dismissive responses when she mentioned something she was excited about. But more significantly, Emma began to articulate the cumulative effect of these interactions. She described how she'd started believing that she was fundamentally unworthy of love, that her father's distant demeanor was somehow her fault, that if she were just different, smarter, prettier, more athletic, he might actually want to spend time with her. "When I'm with him," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling, "I feel like I'm invisible, like I'm a problem he has to deal with. But when I'm with my mom or with Buddy, I feel like I matter. I feel like someone actually wants me around." Dr. Richardson took careful notes, but her eyes remained on Emma, watching her body language, her emotional responses. The way Buddy would shift slightly whenever Emma's voice became particularly strained. The psychologist made a mental note of the dog's behavior, how Buddy seemed to recognize the exact moments when Emma's distress peaked, how he would press closer or make soft vocalizations in response. Over the course of 2 hours, Emma underwent a comprehensive psychological evaluation. She completed standardized assessments designed to measure anxiety, depression, and trauma symptoms. She answered detailed questions about her family history, her coping mechanisms, her support systems. And throughout it all, Buddy remained her anchor, a physical representation of unconditional support. Toward the end of the session, Dr. Richardson asked Emma about her signal with Buddy. Emma hesitantly explained the 6-month training process, the way she and Buddy had developed their private language. She demonstrated the signal, tap, tap on the shoulder, followed by the distinctive whistle pattern. Buddy's response was immediate and perfect. Ears perked, body tensed, alert focus locked on Emma's face. Dr. Richardson watched with keen interest, making additional notes about the behavioral sequence, the authenticity of the dog's response, the way Emma's emotional state seemed to visibly shift when Buddy responded to her distress signal. "This is remarkable," Dr. Richardson said thoughtfully. "This demonstrates several important things. First, it shows Emma's emotional intelligence, her ability to recognize her own needs and develop healthy coping strategies. Second, it demonstrates a profound bond between child and animal that goes far beyond simple pet ownership. And third, it provides objective evidence of Emma's genuine emotional distress." The following day, Emma underwent evaluations with 2 additional court-appointed psychologists. Each session followed a similar pattern: initial comfort building, detailed questioning, careful observation of Emma's emotional responses and Buddy's corresponding behaviors. With each evaluation, Emma found herself able to speak more openly, more honestly, more completely. Dr. James, a trauma specialist, conducted a particularly intensive assessment. He worked with Emma to create a detailed timeline of her father's behavior over the past 2 years, helping her identify patterns that had seemed random or isolated when viewed individually, but became overwhelmingly clear when examined chronologically. "Do you see this pattern?" Doctor asked, pointing to the timeline they'd constructed together. "Your anxiety symptoms intensified right after your father's visits began increasing. Your school performance declined during this same period. Your self-critical thoughts increased significantly. These aren't coincidental. They're connected to a specific environmental stressor." Emma felt something settle in her chest, not happiness exactly, but something like relief. Finally, someone was connecting the dots in a way that made logical sense. Her pain wasn't irrational or imagined. It was a measurable, identifiable response to genuine emotional trauma. During this evaluation, Buddy once again demonstrated his remarkable sensitivity. When Emma discussed particularly painful memories, moments when her father had made especially cutting remarks, Buddy's body would tense, his alert status would increase, and he'd move closer to Emma's side. Doctor observed this pattern repeatedly and made extensive notes about the dog's apparently intuitive understanding of Emma's emotional fluctuations. "This dog," Doctor said toward the end of the session, "is performing a critical therapeutic function. His presence is validating Emma's emotional experience. His behavioral responses are providing objective confirmation of her distress. This is actually similar to professionally trained emotional support animals, except this bond appears to have developed organically between child and pet rather than through formal training protocols." The third evaluation, conducted by Dr. Sarah, a child psychiatrist, took a slightly different approach. Doctor focused on Emma's resilience factors and coping mechanisms, the things that had allowed her to survive and function despite the emotional neglect she was experiencing. "What I'm observing," Doctor said, reviewing her notes, "is a child who should theoretically be showing far more severe psychological symptoms given the circumstances you've described. Yet Emma demonstrates reasonable emotional regulation, strong social connections, meaningful relationships. Why do you think that is, Emma?" Emma looked down at Buddy, her hand finding his fur instinctively. "Because Buddy believes in me," she said simply. "Because my mom believes in me. Because Doctor believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I had people and a dog who loved me. That made a difference." Doctor nodded, making a note. "That's exactly right, and that's going to be important information for the court to understand." By the end of the week, Emma had completed all 3 formal psychological evaluations. The results were remarkably consistent across all 3 independent assessments. Emma demonstrated clear evidence of emotional neglect and psychological trauma related to her interactions with her father. She showed signs of anxiety and depression that were appropriately responsive to her environmental stressors. She exhibited exceptional coping skills and emotional intelligence. And perhaps most significantly, all 3 psychologists independently noted the remarkable therapeutic function Buddy served in Emma's life, and emotional. But the most powerful documentation of all came not from the formal assessments or the psychologist's official reports. It came from the consistent, undeniable evidence of Buddy's behavioral responses throughout each evaluation. Every psychologist independently observed and documented the dog's apparent ability to recognize and respond to Emma's emotional distress with perfect timing and authenticity. Dr. Richardson compiled her observations into her formal report. The subject's emotional support animal demonstrates behavioral patterns consistent with individuals who have years of professional training in trauma response recognition. These patterns appear to have developed organically through the natural attachment process between child and animal, suggesting an extraordinarily strong and mutually beneficial bond. Meanwhile, Emma's mother had been meeting with her own attorney to prepare for the implications of these evaluations. The evidence was mounting, the narrative was shifting, and what had seemed like a crushing defeat in that initial courtroom appearance was beginning to transform into something far more hopeful. 2 weeks after Judge's order for comprehensive evaluation, the psychologist's reports were filed with the court. The message was clear, consistent, and undeniable. Emma's emotional distress was genuine, her father's behavior constituted emotional neglect, and she required protection and therapeutic support. The tide had turned. The truth, in all its forms, spoken through human testimony, revealed through psychological assessment, and communicated through one loyal dog's unwavering recognition of his girl's pain, had finally begun to prevail. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was transformed. What had once felt like a chamber of injustice now carried an almost sacred quality, a space where truth was finally being given proper weight and consideration. Judge's careful attention was evident in every detail. He'd read all 3 psychological evaluations multiple times, his annotations visible in the margins of the document stacked before him. His expression was grave, contemplative, focused. The courtroom was more crowded this time. In addition to the key players from the initial hearing, there were now court officers, the 3 psychologists who had conducted the evaluations, Emma's therapist doctor, and several court staff members. Word had apparently spread about this unusual case, the one involving a young girl, an emotional support dog, and a judge who had fundamentally changed his assessment based on behavioral evidence that transcended traditional legal testimony. Emma sat between her mother and her attorney, with Buddy resting his head on her lap. She wore the same navy dress with white flowers, but this time she felt different in it. Less like a child playing dress-up for a role she didn't understand, and more like someone who had already survived something significant and was now prepared to face whatever came next. Judge called the hearing to order, and his opening remarks immediately signaled that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding. "Before we proceed with the presentation of psychological evaluations," began, his voice carrying a weight of gravity that filled the entire courtroom, "I want to address something that has been troubling me deeply over the past 2 weeks. During our initial hearing, I made a judicial decision based on incomplete information and insufficient consideration of all available evidence. I let professional cynicism and courtroom fatigue cloud my judgment. Today, we are here to correct that error." He looked directly at Emma, and his expression softened in a way that seemed to surprise everyone present. The events that occurred during that first hearing, the behavioral response of this child's emotional support animal, forced me to confront my own biases and limitations. What I witnessed was not a courtroom manipulation. What I witnessed was authentic emotional truth, communicated through a medium I had perhaps underestimated in my years on the bench. Dr. Richardson was called to present her findings first. The psychologist approached the witness stand with her comprehensive report, and her presentation was methodical, detailed, and devastating to Emma's father's case. "Over the course of my evaluation, Dr. Richardson, I administered the Child Behavior Checklist, the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index, and the Children's Depression Inventory to the subject. The results were consistent and concerning. Emma shows elevated anxiety symptoms, depression indicators, and trauma responses that are clinically significant." She presented charts and graphs documenting Emma's psychological profile. However, what's most striking is the temporal relationship between these symptoms and her visits with her father. Emma's anxiety peaks approximately 12 to 24 hours before scheduled visitations. Her depression scores are measurably higher during periods when she's been having regular contact with her father compared to periods of extended maternal custody. Sarah, Emma's attorney, stood and asked, "Dr. Richardson, in your professional opinion, what is causing these psychological symptoms?" Based on my comprehensive evaluation and Emma's detailed account of her interactions with her father, these symptoms are consistent with emotional neglect and emotional abuse. The subject describes a pattern of paternal criticism, dismissal of her feelings, conditional affection, and chronic emotional coldness. These are classic contributors to childhood anxiety and depression. Dr. Richardson paused, then added something that made the courtroom seem to hold its breath. Additionally, I observed the subject's interaction with her emotional support animal throughout multiple sessions. The dog's behavioral responses are extraordinary. They appear to represent genuine recognition of the subject's emotional state rather than conditioned performance. The animal provides consistent therapeutic benefit, and I would recommend that this animal be recognized as essential to the subject's psychological. When cross-examined by Emma's father's attorney, Dr. Richardson remained steadfast in her conclusions. "No," she said firmly, "there is no evidence that the subject's mother coached Emma to report false allegations. In fact, Emma's account contains consistent specific details that are difficult to fabricate, particularly regarding the emotional tone of interactions rather than overtly dramatic incidents." Dr. James provided equally compelling testimony. His presentation focused on the pattern analysis of Emma's symptoms over time, demonstrating a clear correlation between paternal contact and psychological distress. "What's clinically significant," Doctor explained, presenting a detailed timeline, "is that Emma's anxiety didn't develop suddenly. It emerged gradually over an 18-month period that directly corresponds with increased visitation with her father. This is consistent with chronic emotional stressors rather than acute trauma or false memory implantation." He discussed Emma's detailed descriptions of her father's behavior, nodding, "Emma's account contains the kind of mundane, emotionally tinged details that are characteristic of genuine memory rather than coached narrative. She doesn't exaggerate. She doesn't present dramatic stories. She reports a pattern of subtle emotional unavailability and critical commentary that, while not sensational, is profoundly damaging to a child's developing sense of self-worth." Dr. Sarah's testimony perhaps carried the most weight because she focused on Emma's resilience and the protective factors that had prevented her from developing more severe pathology. "What strikes me most about Emma, Doctor, is her remarkable emotional intelligence and her strong social support network. She has a mother who is deeply attuned to her emotional needs. She has a therapist who has helped her develop healthy coping strategies. And she has this dog." Doctor gestured toward Buddy, who lifted his head at the mention, his intelligent eyes scanning the courtroom briefly before returning his attention to Emma. "The animal-human bond I observed between Emma and this dog is extraordinary. It appears to have developed organically, yet it demonstrates characteristics typically associated with professionally trained emotional support animals. The dog's ability to recognize Emma's emotional state appears to be intuitive rather than trained. This suggests a deep, mutual attachment that provides genuine therapeutic benefit." When Sarah asked, "In your professional opinion, Doctor, is Emma's emotional support animal important to her?" Doctor answered without hesitation, "Critically important. In fact, I would say the dog has likely prevented Emma from developing more severe psychological pathology. The animal provides validation, comfort, and emotional grounding that Emma is not consistently receiving from her father and would not be receiving if forced into extended unsupervised visitations." The most dramatic moment came during the presentation of video evidence. Dr. Richardson had, with Emma's permission, recorded several sessions showing Buddy's behavioral responses to Emma's emotional distress. The courtroom watched as the recording showed Emma performing the signal, tap, tap on her shoulder, followed by the distinctive whistle, and Buddy's immediate, authentic response. The dog's transformation in the video was unmistakable. His ears perked with precision, his body tensed in obvious alert status, his eyes locked onto Emma's face with unwavering focus. A single, sharp bark punctuated his protective positioning. There could be no argument about authenticity. There could be no suggestion of performance. The video documented what everyone in the initial hearing had witnessed: genuine, undeniable recognition of emotional distress. Judge watched the video twice, his expression increasingly grave. When it finished, he set down his pen and simply sat in silence for a long moment. Emma's father's attorney attempted to mount a defense, suggesting that the evaluations were biased, that the psychologists had been prejudiced by the dramatic display in the courtroom, that Emma's testimony had been contaminated by her mother's influence. But the evidence was overwhelming, the testimony consistent, the documentation comprehensive. When Emma's attorney called Dr. Emma's own therapist to testify, it provided the final piece of corroboration. "I began working with Emma shortly after her parents' separation," Doctor explained. "Over time, as I observed her psychological state and her descriptions of interactions with her father, I became increasingly concerned about emotional neglect. The signal that Emma and Buddy developed wasn't my treatment plan. It was Emma's creative solution to her own needs. It demonstrates her emotional intelligence and her intuitive understanding that she needed a way to communicate her distress." Judge leaned forward. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, would extended unsupervised visitation with her father be in Emma's best interest?" Doctor's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Absolutely not. Emma would require therapeutic support to process any extended contact with her father, and even then, I would recommend such contact remain structured and time-limited until Mr. Martinez receives significant counseling to address his parenting patterns." As the testimony concluded and both attorneys prepared their closing arguments, the transformation in the courtroom's energy was palpable. What had once seemed like a clear-cut victory for Emma's father had been methodically dismantled, replaced by a comprehensive, multi-source documentation of truth that no reasonable person could dismiss. Emma's attorney delivered her closing argument with quiet power. "Your Honor, we came before you 2 weeks ago with a child's testimony that you dismissed as insufficient. But that child was telling the truth. Every psychologist who has independently evaluated her has confirmed that truth. Every assessment has documented that truth. And perhaps most powerfully, that child's dog has validated that truth in a way that transcends language and legal argument." She paused, looking at Emma with evident compassion. "Your Honor, I ask that you trust the evidence, trust the professionals, and trust the extraordinary voice of a being who knows this child better than anyone, a voice that says, unequivocally, that this child is suffering and needs protection." Judge's ruling, when it came, was decisive and comprehensive. Judge set down his pen with deliberate care, the sound of it meeting the wooden desk echoing through the courtroom like a gavel strike. His expression was grave, contemplative, and something else entirely, a man who had been fundamentally changed by the events unfolding before him. Emma's heart hammered in her chest as she waited for the ruling that would determine the trajectory of her future. Buddy seemed to sense the significance of the moment, pressing even closer against her leg, his entire body radiating protective support. "I have reviewed the comprehensive psychological evaluations conducted by 3 independent court-appointed professionals," Judge began, his voice measured and authoritative. "I have considered the testimony presented by these experts. I have examined the historical context of this case and my own initial assessment of it, and I have arrived at a conclusion that requires me to acknowledge a significant error in judgment on my part." He looked directly at Emma's father, his expression hardening into something unmistakably disapproving. "The evidence presented before this court documents a clear pattern of emotional neglect and emotional abuse perpetrated by Mr. Robert Martinez against his daughter, Emma Martinez. The psychological evaluation results are consistent across all 3 independent assessments. The testimony of licensed professionals is compelling and credible. Most significantly, there exists objective behavioral evidence, documented and witnessed by this court, that demonstrates the genuine psychological distress experienced by the subject child." Emma felt her mother's hand grip hers so tightly it bordered on painful. Sophia's eyes were streaming with tears, her entire body trembling with the weight of what she was hearing. The actions of this child's emotional support animal, Judge continued, while unconventional as evidence in a courtroom setting, represent a form of truth that transcends human testimony and legal argument. That animal's authentic recognition of the child's emotional state provides corroborating evidence of genuine distress that cannot be manufactured, coached, or performed on command. He made several notations on his judicial order, his pen moving with the gravity of fate itself. "I hereby issue the following ruling," announced, his voice filling every corner of the courtroom. "Primary custody of Emma Martinez is granted to her mother, Sofia Martinez, effective immediately. Father's visitation rights are suspended pending the completion of mandated psychological counseling and parenting assessment." Emma's father's face flushed crimson with rage, but he remained silent, clearly recognizing that any outburst would only worsen his position. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "Mr. Robert Martinez is ordered to complete a minimum of 50 hours of individual psychological counseling with a licensed therapist specializing in family dynamics and emotional abuse. He must also complete a parenting skills assessment and demonstrate significant behavioral change before any unsupervised visitation will be reconsidered." Judge then addressed Emma directly, his stern judicial demeanor softening into something more human, more compassionate. "Emma, I want you to know that I believe you. I recognize now that I should have believed you from the beginning. You showed extraordinary courage in coming back into this courtroom and demonstrating the truth in a way that transcended words. What you did took remarkable bravery." Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were not tears of despair. They were tears of relief, vindication, and finally being heard. "One more thing," Judge said, his eyes moving to Buddy. "I am making an unprecedented notation in the court record regarding the role of the emotional support animal in this case. This dog is to be recognized as essential to Emma Martinez's emotional and psychological health. Any future custody arrangements must accommodate the animal's continued presence in the child's primary residence." He looked at the courtroom staff and made a formal pronouncement. "Let it be noted that this animal's behavioral evidence was instrumental in helping this court arrive at a just decision. Sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected sources. This court is humble enough to recognize and honor that." As the courtroom erupted, Emma's mother embracing her tightly, Sarah shaking her head in disbelief at the comprehensive nature of the victory, court officers beginning to process the new custody arrangement. Emma felt something fundamental shift inside her. The weight that had been pressing down on her chest for so long, making it difficult to breathe, finally began to lift. Buddy remained steady through the chaos, his presence an anchor in the storm of emotion. Emma leaned down and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. "We did it, boy," she whispered. "We finally made someone understand." In the days following the ruling, Emma's life underwent a dramatic transformation. She remained in her mother's home, in her own bedroom with her favorite possessions, with Buddy sleeping at the foot of her bed each night. The anxiety that had plagued her began to ease, not disappearing entirely but becoming manageable, less consuming. She found herself able to sleep better, to concentrate in school more effectively, to engage with friends without the constant undercurrent of dread that had characterized her previous existence. Her therapy sessions with Doctor took on a different quality. Rather than processing trauma and managing crisis, they became focused on healing and moving forward. Doctor noted significant improvements in Emma's mood scores, her anxiety measurements, her overall psychological functioning. "You've been carrying such a heavy burden," Doctor said during one session. "Now that the burden has been lifted, your natural resilience is finally able to emerge." Emma's mother seemed to undergo her own transformation. The constant stress and worry that had aged her features seemed to fade. She smiled more readily, laughed more freely, and the tight knot of tension that had permanently etched itself between her eyebrows began to relax. Sophia had been vindicated not just legally but morally. Her instincts about her daughters had been correct, and now the system had affirmed what she had always known to be true. 6 weeks after the ruling, Judge's written opinion was published. It became something of a landmark decision in family law circles, a case study in unconventional evidence, and the importance of considering multiple forms of truth in judicial proceedings. Legal scholars and child psychologists cited it in their work. Several family law attorneys requested copies to use in similar custody disputes. But perhaps most remarkably, the case became the subject of a documentary feature in a psychology journal. Dr. Richardson, doctor collaborated on a comprehensive analysis of the case, focusing on the intersection of human psychology, animal behavior, and the therapeutic significance of human-animal bonds. The article was titled, "When Animals Speak Truth: The Extraordinary Case of a Child's Emotional Support Dog as Behavioral Evidence in Family Law." 3 months after the ruling, Emma received a letter from Judge. It was unusual. Judges typically didn't correspond with the parties in their cases, but felt compelled to reach out. He wrote, "Dear Emma, I wanted to take a moment to tell you how profoundly your case has affected me both professionally and personally. In my 37 years on the bench, I have prided myself on careful judgment and skeptical evaluation of evidence. Your case taught me that skepticism, taken too far, becomes cynicism. It becomes a barrier to truth rather than a protection against falsehood. You and your dog reminded me that truth has many voices, and sometimes the most authentic voice is one we haven't been trained to listen for. I am a better judge because of what you taught me. I am a better human because of what your dog showed me. I wish you a future filled with healing, happiness, and the continued comfort of your remarkable companion. With profound respect and admiration, Judge Harrison." Emma kept the letter in a special place on her nightstand, reading it occasionally when she needed reminding that standing up for the truth, however difficult, was always worth it. As autumn arrived, Emma found herself in a place she hadn't imagined possible 6 months earlier. She was safe. She was believed. She was loved and protected. Buddy remained her constant companion, no longer just an emotional support animal, but a hero in her life story, the being who had given voice to her pain when human language had failed. One afternoon, Emma sat in the backyard with Buddy, the golden retriever's head resting on her lap as she stroked his soft fur. She performed their signal tap, tap on her shoulder, followed by the distinctive whistle pattern, not out of distress this time, but out of gratitude. Buddy's response was perfect as always. Ears perked, alert focus, that single protective bark. But this time, Emma laughed, a sound of genuine joy rather than desperate hope. "I love you, Buddy," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me." The dog's tail wagged, his eyes bright with the simple, uncomplicated love that animals offered so freely to those they cherished. In that moment, Emma understood something profound. Sometimes the greatest strength comes not from lawyers or judges or psychological testimony, but from the unwavering loyalty of a being who loves you unconditionally. Years later, when Emma was older, she would tell this story to others, how a devoted dog had taught a skeptical judge about the power of truth, how courage and loyalty had transformed a courtroom into a place of justice, how sometimes the most extraordinary evidence comes wrapped in fur and unconditional love. But in that moment, sitting beneath the autumn sun with her best friend by her side, Emma simply allowed herself to be happy. The storm had passed, the truth had prevailed, and life finally was beginning again. The end.